All right, hello. All right, trying again. I'm gonna keep talking so Catherine can mess with levels. Are we good?
You don't have the fuzzy thing, so that might be part of it.
Oh, that's right. Mine is kind of broken. I won't talk very long. Hi, I'm Jen Minette. I'm outreach coordinator here at the Castle Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Lunch and Learn, and I will try not to move. Couple housekeeping announcements before we get started. If you need a restroom at any point, that is you, Tom.
What are you doing?
Here I am trying to be really still just in case it is. You didn't know you came for the comedy show, right? Okay. Gotta give it a moment.
Deduct that from my speaking time.
Oh my gosh, these people are like, why did we come? What is going on? It's okay. It's all right. Just do a little improv for you. It's fine. Okay, restroom is located just out that back door if you need that at any point. There's also a little bit of coffee and some cookies and things in the back. Please help yourself at any time during the presentation if you get a little peckish or you need a little more caffeine. Go for it. Upcoming, our next Lunch and Learn, because we always do Lunch and Learns on 2nd and 4th Tuesdays. So the next one would be October 28th. And we're going to change it up to something a little special. We have a short documentary. It's about 50 minutes long, so it will fit into our time together. It's about the Purple Gang, specifically their activity in Clare. So a slightly different view of the Purple Gang, thinking about it from a small town perspective. Good reminder, let's silence our phones. So please join us for that if you can. We will not be live streaming that one for copyright issues, right? So that one, if you want to see the documentary, you will have to come in person. Our next speaking event is our History After Hours, and that will be this Thursday, October 16th. It's our last one of the year. We only run these in the warmer weather months and when it's a little lighter outside. We have Dr. Amy French from Delta College, who will talk about Bossert v. Cleary, Michigan barmaids, and the fight for civil rights. A little bit of a legal theme this week, which Tom is going to get into, so I don't want to steal too much thunder, but we do have an exhibit on display right now, Order in the Court, the legacy of Saginaw's courthouses. And so this week we're just kind of having a legal theme. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tom Trombley, our Vice President and Chief Historian. Probably doesn't need much more of an intro because you are Mr. History for Saginaw.
Well, and I've also made quite an entrance with my jacket problem.
I mean, yes, there you go. So anyway, thank you, Tom. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I promise to be a little more professional, or try to, than my entrance with the microphone issue. Before I start, how many of you remember the previous courthouse? Not as many as I thought, but I have very fond memories of it. My grandfather's office was in the basement, that incredibly elegant area of the building. The building was really a landmark on the west side for generations, from its completion in 1885 until its demolition in 1972. And what kind of the sub-theme, we're going to use a series of seriographs created by Sam Carter and Ralph Mishak at the time the building was demolished, as an entry into it. We have part of that set on display in the current exhibit, May It Please the Court, Order in the Court, excuse me, I went with the previous title, but we're going to use those as kind of an entry, but also to kind of think of how buildings connect us with the past, but also the way that they serve to kind of jog our memory and connect us with various points. Who's seen the series of seriographs in other places other than Okay, and that shows that just one of the things with memory, when you think of it, is how time moves forward. When I was young, I mean, there were 100 of these sets, probably a few more than that, produced, and they were very prominently displayed in attorneys' offices, businesses. Second National Bank had one in their West Side office. Funeral cases had a set, I believe, in their funeral home. They were really all over. Today, they're not as common, although they still serve to connect us. With that, this is my title slide, but we have a photograph of the building, an article about the series, and a photograph of the demolition. This building came down at a time of profound change in Saginaw. It was a time, not that Saginaw ever really had a time when buildings weren't coming up and buildings weren't coming down. That was common, but in the 1960s, there was really a wholesale demolition with the idea of redeveloping the community. Saginaw was at that time the 5th largest city in Michigan, and it ties into many things that were going on in Saginaw, but it also meant that Saginaw, unlike Bay City or Midland, really had access to a tremendous amount of federal dollars that the smaller cities did not. So the idea was really to redevelop and create a new city. I remember when I got in terrible trouble in 5th grade about the time this happened, not terrible trouble, but with my teacher, 6th grade teacher, because I really was very saddened by what was happening in Saginaw. He was a Bay City person, and he was just so enthusiastic about what the store cheese graters that were going up on stores, and thick carpeting is what he wanted to see in buildings. I just remember that, but this photo brings back memory. But this is Washington Avenue, but it was a scene throughout the community. Of course, it was a time when the expressway was going in, so there was a tremendous amount of demolition with that. Also, realigning the community for growth, but also things that really were not so positive, even if you love the idea of tearing down old buildings, that there were really racial motives behind much of the demolition and expressway construction. That said, it also made a market for the type of series that we're going to look at. The two artists that moved forward with that really popularized these were Ralph Meshach and Sam Carter. Ralph Meshach was, and I always say Meshach, and I know most people say Meshach. I'm going on the pronunciation I learned from my junior high school art teacher who babysat for him. But I've also known other people that were his babysitters, and they say Meshach. So I'm giving up hope in believing babysitters' name pronunciation. Ralph Meshach was born in Chicago in 1930, studied at the Art Institute of Chicago, and came to Saginaw as a commercial artist. Sam Carter was an artist. Who recognized the Carter shop name, the Carter name?
No.
What do you recognize it as?
Clothing store.
A clothing store. Sam Carter was born, and I left my notes upstairs, I think it's 22 or 23, was about my parents' age. He went to Saginaw High School. He had a great interest in art, but he also was the son of Samuel Carter Sr., who had started a clothing shop. It originally had been a grocery store. When they moved to the west side of the river, it became a clothing store that later had branches and also operated town and country. His interest in art, we're not talking about the clothing shop today, his interest in art started young, and here's just some articles that reflect 1940, when he was, I think, at Central Junior High School. He did the cover for the annual Reflector. He won an award from the Walther League when he was at Saginaw High for the church he attended. Just more photographs of artistic endeavors. But his career focus, and actually what allowed him to practice art, was operating a very successful women's clothing line, chain of women's clothing shops. And so Ralph Misiak, he, just like Sam Carter, in a different sort of way, he may have been a commercial artist, but he had really this interest in depicting his local community. And he soon was branching out, becoming very involved in the local art scene in Saginaw, especially amateur artists. And soon Carter and Misiak met with some other people, and they produced a series of 8 original prints of Saginaw that included this view of the courthouse. But it's interesting, this was published, I think, in 1963, I do have it right, in 1963. For the couple of you who remember the courthouse, do you see something odd about the courthouse in this depiction? It actually depicts the courthouse as it was up until 1925-27, when it was a much smaller building. It was enlarged at that time. And Misiak pointed out that he spent as much time researching the historic subjects that he would depict as he would creating the drawings that he created. Carter and Misiak had a really productive partnership. They would go on to do the illustrations together for Indian Jackson Pine, which was written by Stuart Gross, who was at one time a board member of this institution. Who's read Indian Jackson Pines? And so did you realize who did the drawings for it? Okay. And the technique they used, sometimes people get confused how the illustrations are created. It's a silkscreen process. And I suspect it's Ralph Misiak who was the one that taught Sam Carter to do this, or at least interested in him, because it's really a commercial art technique. What it is the same technique that, just a finer version of it, that's used to create T-shirts, or was, I don't know, I've lost track of all the new techniques that have been added, but it's a silkscreen, it's a photographic process that creates templates that allow you to create multiple, each colors applied separately, and a seriograph is just the fine art term for it. And we're not going to, this isn't a class on learning how to do seriographs, and if I was, I would be sadly lacking in the skills to teach you how to do it. Misiak, I've seen some of his paintings. We do not have one, but he not only produced seriographs, he also produced numerous other scenes. One of the ones that a lot of people are aware of was, who's seen this one before? I get a lot of people who call and want one of these. These were produced, an edition of 1,000 was produced, and they're actually not a true seriograph, the ones that are available, but were produced as the bicentennial project for this local chapter of the American Institute of Architects, depicting old buildings in Saginaw. Misiak's career wasn't limited to Saginaw. He did a series for the state capitol, and it was at that time when the capitol was really endangered. It was really had been altered with lower ceilings, fire doors. It was really air conditioners all over. It was not the restored vision building that you see today, and the group that was advocating for its future preservation commissioned a series for that. Sam Carter And they continued to do partnership things together in the 70s, but he also loved to depict nature. This is a series I'm very fond of that he did of an orchard on Gratiot. Actually, it was one his brother had invested in. Sam Carter also did a series alone. It's one of the last ones he did it before he left Saginaw in the early 80s. He did a series of the West Side that included the courthouse right on the cover. Of course, in the book, it's the building, the other building of the courthouse. So what I thought I would do is use, and this isn't going to go on forever, then I will go into the gallery afterwards if anybody has questions about the exhibit. The focus here is on the courthouse as a building itself. And courthouses have many functions. They are the place where both the circuit and the district and probate court, I left the probate court and put the and in the wrong place, meet. But it's also a place, and really it's the first floor of the building, is devoted to where vital records are kept for property, for people. It's where all the townships meet. And actually, when the first courthouse was constructed, I think there was one supervisor for each township that worked on making the decisions for designing the building. It's funny that Hollister, who was the architect, wanted to continue after dealing with the crew of 28. So what in, buildings, sometimes when I give walking tours or something, people want to know when something is completed, when something's at its perfect state. Cities evolve and grow. There's things that we sadly miss and mourn their loss, but then sometimes they're replaced by absolutely sublime things. And it's sometimes like this building was more than doubled in size, and it's sublime the way it is, but there are parts that were lost in that 1937 remodeling, and that's the case with the courthouse. But at the time that Sam Carter and Ralph Misiak created this series in 1969, the courthouse, the county knew it was getting a new building, and the Board of Commissioners that was now changing into the Board of Supervisors, which was changing over to a much more manageably sized Board of Commissioners, weren't going to waste any funds on improving or taking care of the building. It was a building that the clock, I was born in 1958, and I never remember the clock working. One of the statues had lost its arm, and that was a deliberate thing, but lost its arm in a storm in the 1940s. So it was a building that was deteriorating, but they chose through these seriographs to really present it in an idealized state. And it's a building that had replaced an absolutely wonderful 1837 courthouse that was on the same location. And this is what the building looked like in 1884. Saginaw had really, and still has, a courthouse square, and I gave a tour on that earlier this year, and we just explored that to some degree in the exhibit. But Saginaw was laid out in 1830 with the idea that there would be a town green and a courthouse square that really are the center of what was a separate city, but is now the West Side Business District. So this is a photograph, and I put the wrong arm down. Well, no, I didn't. I have it correct. The statue lost it in a storm, and that is not the one we have on display. The statues were notoriously fragile. It was a building that had been enlarged, as I said, in the 1920s. Here it is in April 1926 with the additions nearing completion. And I just, this is the building in the 1950s. There it is as they depict it. And there it is just before its demolition. And if I had that larger, you'd see how they've really made it appear much better. And here it is from the east, which is a 1920s facade of the building, and here's kind of the capture of that building. And at the time, the Board of Supervisors agonized over how much they could spend on the addition. We tell the story in the exhibit, but the architect for the addition was Samuel Adams from Saginaw in conjunction with the Detroit architect of Louis Kemper, and it's a complicated and not fully documented story how he formed that partnership. The entrance the to the building. And you know, one of the things that you'll notice, if you look carefully at the photographs, even by this time, by the 1950s, the cast zinc capitals on the columns had been changed with just this odd sheet metal top going forward. And these spots in the sidewalk will assume are shadows, but may very well be cracks. You know, one of the things that really the series doesn't go into depth, but really is important to understand in the building, is just how, you know, the three-story building contains so many different functions. This is the treasurer's office. This is the Wellington R. Burt, the Gambo case for Wellington R. Burt in the courtroom on the second floor. And when the building was dedicated in 1884, it only had one courtroom. By that time, we'll see that it had been subdivided, and then you get up into the mechanics of the tower, which was really wonderful. Inside, they really capture the front hall, which what I remember about it is the white and black marble and slate floor. It was really beautiful. And here you capture it when the building's being demolished. You can see the same woodwork that's in the photograph. There was an auction to sell things, but not all the woodwork was kept by any means. I don't have a copy of the stairway seriograph. We don't have one in the collection, but the staircase was the center point of the building. And one of the stories associated with that was the building was nearing completion in 1884. There was a major fire in the building. It was caused by spontaneous combustion, with the contractor and the furniture manufacturer blaming each other. The story's in the exhibit. So actually in the seriograph, that's the second version of the staircase, same as the first, but it had to be reconstructed after the fire. The courtroom, which had incredibly elegant detailing, but one of the things, you know, this is where a seriograph makes something that was probably pretty painful a little less painful. Notice it has an acoustical tile ceiling because the courtrooms were not this glorious almost story and a half style story space that we see in the photograph of the Gambo case. They actually had been, and I really went off looking at the details, and they had lost a lot of details as well. Notice the stained glass windows, which by the 1960s had long been removed. And you can see them from the outside. But then the thing that they really don't capture, this is the remnants of the 1884 courtroom, but then above that courtroom is this less than glorious space, which is in the same building. It's amazing what you can do with a few steel beams and some paneling. One of the stories that really is kind of interesting about the building, originally the city jail was on the north side of Court Street. In the 1926-27 renovation, a new jail which was more than an expansion, a new jail was constructed. And at that time, the county purchased an existing house from the architect Harker Jackson, and they added the jail onto the courthouse, to the house. So this is a the 1927 jail, but then the sheriff's residence was immediately in front, and was an existing 1870s house, late 60s, early 70s house. There it's being constructed. There it is coming down. Now there is a story. You may have heard, has anybody heard the story? Does this mean anything to anyone? Good, you're not one of the people that have called me to ask if this is true or not. This is the Brockway house on Brockway. There is a story, and it is a story, that these columns were from the 1837 courthouse. But if you remember your grade school learning the orders of columns, those are Corinthian, those are Ionic or composite, I don't know which anymore, but they're not the same. What happened was the house that stood, remember I said this was Harker Jackson's house? Harker Jackson, who was trained as an architect, he did design the original Saginaw Country Club and a few other buildings. Harker Jackson sold his house and bought the Brockway house on Brockway and proceeded to expand it and make it into a much grander house. And Harker Jackson evidently had salvaged the columns, according to the story, from Dr. Florentine's Hospital for Women on Washington Avenue. And you can see where those are, appear to be those columns. So what he did, what's happened is Jackson expanded the one house. He had a house next to the courthouse. People conflated it together to make a really much grander story than it probably is. So this is just the final view of the demolition of the jail. I think the basement's absolutely wonderful. Here's the photograph of it. Those arches, those are in the 1884 part of the building. And in the basement, there were various offices, including the County Road Commission's office. This may be when they're off-site, but the one on the left, I'm quite certain, is in the building. One of the things above the building, so, we have this first floor. We've seen there, in the lithographs, they only capture the public spaces. They don't capture in the lithographs the clerk's office, the Register of Deeds office, and then they collect. They do seriographs of the courtroom, but then they kind of move up into the tower where the clock is, which is an E.H. Howard tower clock, a really wonderful clock, and that one is actually the property of the museum. Ralph Strobel, who was with the museum at the time, really worked hard to save it, and later on in the late 80s and 90s, I think I've got the years right, local groups constructed a tower to house it on the courthouse green. And here it is in its original location. One of the fun things that we have photographs of is the tower was fully accessible. My father always described how lunchtime when he was at North Intermediate School, he'd run down to the courthouse during lunch and run up to the top of the courthouse to look over the city. And I don't see his initials, so I think he's innocent of this. But both the bell and these photographs of the wall contained incredible documentation for those who went there. The bell, which we had on the back porch for a long time in the 1980s, was filled with things. So this is just back to the first floor, and just kind of giving an idea that, they capture the building in a way that's very elegant, but this is the commissioner's office, which was the other major space on the second floor, which is not included in the seriographs, but it had been divided as well to create this little small space, low ceiling space. The building, if you were here in Saginaw for 3 years, the old courthouse, deteriorating, but still in use, stood right in front of the building. They actually had to tear the bare back steps off to construct the new building. The series ends with that, but the story continued because before the building was demolished in 1973, they had an auction. And we have a couple of items that have come to us from that auction, and also the museum was allowed at that time to select some things. One of the things we have are some of the custom-made furniture that was made by the building's architect, designed by the building's architect, Fred Hollister, and made by Conant Brothers of Ohio. And I mean, it was everything from the sublime to the fire hazard. And I just, One of the things we have are a series of snapshots that Ralph Strobel took from the tower. I'm not going to in detail, but this is roughly the same view of the jail in 1885 and then St. John's Episcopal Church, and there is through the window of the clock tower in 1973. This is looking over the other way. The statues were saved. I think that when demolition started, was planned, they thought they were more durable than they were. They were saved to go to SVSU. I know at one time, one of them was out there. Some of them broke apart, I believe. And the one we have came to us. I think it was the one that was at SVSU, ended up in a cornfield. Irene Hensinger was able to reobtain it for the museum, and there is another one floating around. But they were made by the John Siddons Company of, I think it's Buffalo. They're made of pressed zinc over a metal armature and are very fragile. And these are not the only ones in the world like that. You know, this is where I just kind of wanted to end, just kind of this idea of what we remember about buildings and how they really shape communities. The architect of the courthouse was Fred Hollister. Hollister came to Saginaw with his family, and he learned architecture as one did at that time by studying. He originally worked for J.B. Dibble, who was the architect of the Taylor House. The Taylor House would become the Fordney Hotel. Dibble also designed the home on Washington Avenue, which was the Corning residence that became the home for the aged in the early 20th century. Hollister then worked for a Bay City firm, opened an office in Saginaw for that firm, and then became very interested in politics, going on to serve in the state legislature, which in the 19th century, without as many constrictions with conflict of interest, I think was a pretty advantageous thing if you want to specialize in school and public buildings. And we know he did buildings throughout the state and even into some other states. But in Saginaw, the two probably best known buildings that remain by him are the stable, which was originally Benjamin's livery stable and undertaking establishment on Hamilton Street, the Clarence and Susie Hill house just down the street from this. He also did Clarence Hill's half-brother's house, Arthur Hill's house. He did the old Arthur Hill High School when it was the Saginaw City High School, actually. The building on the top is in Manistee, and it is a fire station. And then on the bottom is a fragment of the original I can't talk today, was the original fragment of the original Isabella County Courthouse. They kept the cupola, and it's kind of oddly, I've never actually seen it in person, but on the ground. Has anybody ever seen it? But that's actually by Fred Hollister. And I was thinking of other ways. There are some other fragments of the courthouse that remain. There is, that's telling me that I should be nearing an end. The other kind of fragments that exist of the courthouse, Hamilton Square on the corner of Van Buren and Hamilton Street. Courtroom doors are used outside of that, and there used to be some additional fragments Pat Scheck had purchased at the auction on display. Zenders actually, the Zender family purchased an entire the 1920s probate courtroom, dismantled it, had it re-erected in the restaurant, and it's now used as an office. And then sometimes, this kind of idea, and this really seems appropriate, that since so few of you remember the original courthouse, we have in our collection, this view of the 1837 courthouse, and that is the only view we have in the collection. There is another view that it was published in a book, and that's the one I always have to direct people to. This is a copy of a Goodrich Brothers photograph, and I never understood why they took this photograph. I mean, why do you take a photograph? This is a public meeting hall. The jail is over here sometimes. No, I'm sorry. This is the nothing like remembering the thing that was corrected. This was the annex to the 1837 courthouse. So you might think that's the subject, but the real subject of this photograph is that tree. It turned out, and does anybody recognize that tree? Up until 6 months ago, I didn't know the story of the tree. But the tree was one of, perhaps one, if not the only, of the original virgin stand of trees that were on the west side that was allowed to remain. And I mean, it has to be one of the original plant because it's there. That's an 1870s photo, and that's more than 30 years old in that photo. And it was one that, as they said, a lot of business had been transacted under, and people had become very fond of. And before the 1884 courthouse was constructed, there's an article in the newspaper talking about propping up the tree with an iron armature that they hoped that it would last longer. So, you know, the reason for creating this stereographic view was, is long forgotten, but it had meaning to those who commissioned it and owned a copy. So with that, I will go into the exhibit, but first of all, are there questions or comments or memories of the courthouse? Even the current courthouse is up for grabs, for conversation.
The reason the old courthouse was taken down was because it was beyond repair.
The reason it was taken down, it was too small. And, just as county government what county government provided between well, first of all, the county had grown greatly in population, but between 1837 and 1968, the functions of county government had totally changed. And so it really was a building that was shoehorned in. And at one time, even like County Normal at the turn of the century had offered classes in the courthouse. So, I mean, it had shoehorned everything out into other adjoining buildings. Secondly, it was a building, that had been designed for gas light. The 1920s part had been originally electricity, but the amount of restrooms and everything were different. And because of the overflowing flooring, it was considered a fire hazard, and there was no sprinkler system. So, so the decision was made to demolish rather than trying to build an addition and to do it, which was in keeping with the time. There was a bond issue that failed 2 times, if I remember correctly, before it finally passed. And one of the things that originally had been proposed was building the courthouse on the east side. That had been a long time debate or friction between the west and east side. And when they actually stipulated it would be on that location, of course, they had the outpouring of the west side business owners to keep the courthouse there. So in a lot of it was not considered. It was a 70-year-old building that wasn't functioning well. And I do remember, I remember going to get a copy of my birth certificate when I was about 6 years old and sitting there, and it was so hot. We were going to Canada, our family was going to Canada, and we needed the birth certificate. I must have been a little over than, I'll make myself seem like I wasn't misbehaving at 7 or 8, but it was just so very hot. So by that time, even by the mid-60s, you did expect air conditioning in a building as opposed to, just having tall ceilings. And I'm certain that upper courtroom above the original courtroom, and there were other spaces, or the, the sub commissioner's room above, attic must have been unbearable on a hot day. So, and I mean, it was, one of the functions of a courthouse, beyond being for court in the functions, is to being an absolutely secure place to store records. I mean, that is, especially before digitization, it really, that's one of your main duties. If you're the clerk or the register of deeds, you are charged with, assuring those records are absolutely safe.
I guess I'm just sentimental.
Well, yeah, and a person I knew who came to Saginaw in the late 60s, he commented was, everybody's up in arms that the building's going to be demolished. Didn't they kind of get the hint when they tore the back steps off of it and started to construct the new building so close to it? And I mean, but, it was a story we played countless times in Saginaw. And a lot of that has to do, there is a preservation theory, I wouldn't say theory, but there is a statement in Michigan that communities that thrive by the automobile have because of their place in General Motors and Ford's, thrive because of automotive production, really have a different view towards the built environment. So Saginaw, Detroit, and Flint really view it like you need a new model every year, whereas Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids, cities that have other things have a little less knock it down and build something new. And I don't know, it's not something you have to. Are there other questions? And I'll promise a shorter answer. Yes.
I think I'm confused. From the beginning, the courthouse, from the beginning, was always on
That side of
the
land.
same property.
Yes.
So you have the original one, which you said burned down.
No, the original one didn't burn. There was a fire in the one. So what they do in 1830, with the 1837 one, they shear off some of the porticos, the back portico, and truck it across the street. This is before indoor plumbing and electricity. You just have to have a gas connection for your gas light. And so that is where the town commons is, in front of what was the jail at that time. This building, it's technically on the same site, but it is actually a block behind it.
Because I'm wondering, okay, so you had the original one and that went away, and then you had the next one, which was the big...
The one we've talked about.
One, and then the new one. What
But
was the sequence of building?
So the new one, they tore, the one that is there now is about a half a block behind the original one. So what they did, they closed Fayette Street and built it. Part of it does take the original site. They literally tore off the west stairway so they could build as close as possible. And then that front entrance plaza, that is covers maybe about a third of the original footprint of the original one. So it is technically on the same site, but it does incorporate. Yeah, but the 1837 one, and part of the deed of gift from Samuel Dexter to the community was that would always, or to the county of Saginaw, that would be the site of a public building, that the adjoining property on the north side of the street would be a town green, and the Board of Commissioners, the Board of Supervisors, spent an inordinate amount of time panicking about there was a reversion clause in the deed of gift, that if plunking the courthouse on that north side would bring that into play. And they decided, since they weren't putting in foundations and it was temporary, that it would. But it was
My confusion was you got old and new going on.
yeah. So, but does it make sense? And to complete the new building, they had to go in the front. Any other questions? With that, I will
point out that you wanted, as part of this talk, to invite people
Yeah,
to follow you into the gallery, which you've mentioned. So if you've ever wanted, to view an exhibit with a gallery guide, you can follow Tom in, but your question about like how that looked, there are photographs in the exhibit that show that sequence, so it could be more clear there. But before we leave this room, let's Tom. Okay.